Hi, welcome back to PC Builder. I'm Jason. We have so many great questions for this month's Q&A. We've got questions about, of course, the GPU market, but we've also got a lot of really interesting questions around the Alder Lake launch. Was it a huge fail or was it a success for Intel? And should you buy one or should you consider Ryzen? We've got DDR4 versus DDR5 questions, Windows 10 versus Windows 11, and a lot of other great stuff coming up. So remember, if you get value out of the video, give it a like. It really makes a big difference for the channel. And of course, subscribe and click that bell icon. That way you get notified when we release new content. With that, let's jump into it. All right, first question. All of your dreams ask, why is Alder Lake not selling? Is it the lack of GPUs? Are people scared from the it's too hot reviews in terms of the thermals and the power usage? Other reasons? I'm glad I'm not the only one who's noticed this because it has been bugging me a little bit. And I've also been checking just like other creators in terms of their overall view count on some of their Alder Lake stuff. And, I'm just detecting a lot less enthusiasm for this launch than other launches in the past, even 11th gen and 10th gen Intel, which is a little crazy. Now, let's take a look at Alder Lake i5 and i7 and i9 processors. It's typically the case that no matter what, the highest end, which in this case is a 12900K, will sell out. There's just far fewer of them because of the way that they've done the binning. They've only been the best chips to be able to be 12900Ks, and everything else becomes a 12700K or an i5 12600K. So it's not surprising, even among a lukewarm launch, we'd see something like the 12900K sell out. But the 12700K hasn't sold out once, and neither has the 12600K here either. Now, yes, the KF parts are hard to come by. That doesn't surprise me either because in order to create a KF part, they basically take a K part with 12600K, and then they're like, oh, the integrated graphics on this isn't going to pass muster, so they just go ahead and disable it. So those are actually down bin products. That's typically why they sell them for less, because you're getting less for them. So it doesn't surprise me that those sold out quickly, / maybe weren't really that many in stock to begin with. But I have not seen the 12600K or the 12700K go out of stock. I've just noticed that between myself and other creators and these sales numbers, Alder Lake does not seem to be doing that well. A couple reasons I think that might be the case is yes. Number one, you can't get a graphics card. Who cares if it's got 10% more performance than a Ryzen 5600X at about the same price point if you can't get a GPU in the first place to experience that performance? Right? It doesn't really make any sense. So why would you upgrade? Why wouldn't you wait until we see Ryzen 3D sometime early in 2022 when you actually might be able to get a graphics card? So I don't feel like there's a rush. It's great that Intel's competitive again. I think because that's going to drive AMD in a way that AMD drove Intel, and that competition is good for us, the consumer. But ultimately, I just feel like, it's not the big exciting launch it could have been. I think it's the GPUs, and I also think a lot of people are just a little sick and tired of the big companies like Intel kind of winning the day, and they'd like to see the underdogs like AMD win. Now we've got a lot of really great market questions about whether or not the Alder Lake CPUs are even worth it compared to Ryzen, and will Ryzen drop its prices? We got great questions from Samus, from Kyle, Winter Speed, and Mohammed Shoaib. I think that in terms of is it worth it, especially a lot of the questions asked about the overall platform itself. The motherboards are more expensive. What about DDR5? All kinds of questions. Yeah, I think there's some really off-putting things in terms of buying into this new platform. Maybe Intel packaged a couple too many early adopter things. PCIe 5.0. Nobody needs 5.0. Yes, they're using the faster PCIe lanes, same number of lanes, but faster lanes to get you more rear USB connectivity and more front panel USB connectivity. Additional Thunderbolt support. That's fantastic. But let's be honest, does anyone pining away for PCIe 5 devices? No. So maybe it didn't make sense to also adopt PCIe 5.0 at the same time, because that certainly raised the cost of the motherboards, I would assume, right? Licensing the new technology, implementing it, and being an early adopter. At the same time, you're doing that with DDR5, and it's a new socket. So either you got to go out and get a new cooler, or you got to reach out to your cooler company and get a new bracket for it, maybe, or a backplate. Maybe it costs you some money to do that. There's just a lot of like little things in there that I think are deterring people from being interested in Alder Lake, and look, the motherboard prices are stupid high. You know, the motherboard I'm recommending, the cheap motherboard, is $220 or $230. It's the Gigabyte Gaming X. But yeah, I definitely agree with everybody right now. In terms of the platform, there's a lot of little things that add up to just some reluctance to buy into that right now. In terms of whether or not Ryzen should lower its prices, I think they absolutely should. If you're asking my opinion whether or not they should, yes, they absolutely should. I've seen a lot of people saying, oh, well, Intel didn't lower their prices when Ryzen was ahead, and so now Intel can come back and charge $600. I'm like, but Intel lost a massive amount of market share. They've lost a massive amount of the consumer segment that isn't even interested in their products anymore because they've so turned off the market. They didn't want to compete on price. They just wanted to bury their heads in the sand. I think that was a disastrous strategy for Intel in the long run. Overall, if I were AMD, the 5600X would be a $200 processor. I would even go a little bit lower than that. It's been out for a year. Certainly, the 3600 does not cost the MSRP a year after the launch. And unfortunately, because of shortages, it now costs a lot more than that. And certainly, the 3700X did not cost MSRP a year out. It was significantly cheaper. If I were AMD, I would do that. As the saying goes, you have to dance with the one that brought you. A lot of us supported AMD in the lean times. I think it's time for AMD to stick with us the way we stuck with AMD. Whether or not they're going to actually do that, we'll see. DDR5 versus DDR4 memory. Umar, Hayal, King, and Bosvark all ask essentially the same question, which is DDR5 worth it now over DDR4? And if it's not, will it ever be worth it in the future? Like when will the price come down to a point where it will be worth it? It's currently not worth it right now under, I don't think, any circumstances. There are some very, very niche applications. So if you do some very, very specific things and you know it works well for you, then by all means do it. Otherwise, DDR4, even the fastest DDR4 for like 4000 memory would make a lot more sense, I think, than DDR5, at least in the current iteration. That has a lot to do with the memory controller and the fact that you're running DDR5 asynchronously from the speed of the memory controller. Well, you get to run it synchronously with DDR4. And that actually, the reduction in latency and some other things really improves that bond. Now, DDR5 will get better. The first generation of a new technology typically kind of sucks. Everyone goes out and they have to have it. They spend way too much money. It delivers about maybe 25% of what it promises. And then the next generation typically makes a much bigger leap once there's more adoption. The other problem with DDR5 is that there's just not enough mass production of it right now where it's at all cost effective to buy it. That will change. Just like SSDs used to be stupid expensive, then they got cheaper, and then NVMe's came out, and they were stupid expensive even compared to the SATA SSDs, and they got cheaper. That's just the way technology works. When is that going to happen? I don't, you've got me on that with the shortages, shipping challenges, everything else going on. I would typically say, maybe in about a year and a half, we'll start seeing DDR5 make some more sense with the next launch, maybe with the AMD's AM5 launch. But right now, it doesn't make any sense, and it's, I would say, at least a year and a half, but probably 2 years in the current environment away before it makes any sense for people to invest in. As usual, we've got a ton of questions on the GPU crisis and the GPU market. When will things get better? When do I think it'll get lower from the absurdly high prices? Asked Hari. Lubavir asked, when will the GPU market stabilize? And when it stabilizes, what about the cost of other components? Will that suddenly shoot up? Ayush asked, will it come back down by next September? And Kareem saying, hey, how's the GPU pricing? I just did my GPU update video. If you haven't watched that, I'll leave a link up there in the card to it, where I go through the current market conditions. Remember, the GPU crisis will end. It will come to an end when one of two things happens, but probably number two. The first one is Intel is going to launch discrete GPUs, a new players entering the GPU market, and they're going to bring in a new level of production, so we'll get more supply into the overall network. That's great. And that won't happen until probably the beginning of the second quarter of 2022. So we're talking, what is that, April or May. At about the same time, you're going to see Ethereum, knock on wood when I say this, should be going to proof of stake. They're going to go through the merge, and that will end GPU mining for Ethereum. Because Ethereum is about 90 to 95% of all GPU mineable currencies in terms of market cap. That means money being actually made and money actually in existence. The huge mining bubble that's been built up will completely collapse. and a lot of miners will be forced to sell their GPUs off because they won't be able to literally recoup the energy cost of the cards themselves. And a lot of their value is actually locked up in their rigs. So if those rigs are no longer profitable, the thing that's going to make the most sense for them is to sell them off on the used card market. Last time I said this, people said, oh my gosh, Jason, but I don't want to buy a used GPU. It's okay that you don't want to buy a used GPU. Other people will buy the used GPUs, and that's going to drive down eventually retail prices for new cards because that segment of the demand will be satisfied getting an RTX 3090 for like $300 or $400 rather than paying, you know, a higher fee for a new one. They'll be happy to grab that graphics card and do something else with it. So that's what's going to happen. Now, when that happens, will we see motherboard prices? Will we see memory and others? We might see the price of everything else start to go up as people build systems. What's holding back those prices right now? And you can get on eBay. I did a whole video about how scalpers have completely crashed motherboard prices if you don't mind buying one brand new, but from a scalper who bought a GPU and sold the GPU, and they had to get a motherboard or a power supply or something with it, and now they're just trying to get rid of that for whatever value they can. You can actually go out and get a pretty good deal on a motherboard if you don't buy it from Amazon or Newegg or a retailer, if you instead buy off eBay or a third-party site. So I think that this is all going to happen about the midway through next year. We're going to see that flood of graphics cards hit. I firmly believe this. Could I be wrong? Of course I can be wrong. But as long as the market is just kind of continuing like it is and these other things fall into place with Intel increasing market, launching their GPUs, and with Ethereum going to proof of stake, if those are the primary drivers, then yeah, graphics card prices are going to absolutely crater, and we're going to enter what I hope to be a golden age of PC building. So that's the short answer there. All right, let's jump over to a speed round of questions. Let's start off. Christian Paris, how do you set up your PC after building it? Like the RAM, the fan speeds, everything else that you should do after building it. I'm going to do a video on that. I know I've promised it. It is coming probably in December, so just stay subscribed for that. Tillian asks, if we're building a new AMD Ryzen PC, should we install Windows 10 or Windows 11? What would I recommend? Honestly, I would still stick with Windows 10. It's a little bit more complicated than that. Windows 10, they did fix Windows 11 rather for Ryzen. It seems like looking at all the Alder Lake testing that got done, but you know, Hardware Unbox and Gamers Nexus and others, and looking at their Ryzen results on both Windows 10 and Windows 11, because some people use 10, some people use 11, the results are fairly close now, whereas they were completely garbage on Windows 11 before they rolled out that fix. However, I don't see a compelling reason to upgrade to Windows 11 right now. If everything's running for you really well on Windows 10, I wouldn't upgrade right now. There's more features for Windows 11 that are coming down the pike that may make it worth the upgrade in the future, their version of direct storage and some other things. But right now, to me, it's just not tempting at all. I might upgrade one of my PCs just to have a test bench, but otherwise, everything I'm doing right now is still Windows 10. Amin asks, how is a dual fan GPU compared to a regular 3-fan? For example, a Zotac 3070 dual fan versus a tri-fan Gigabyte version. Here's the big thing about the number of fans. Fans are great, but they are honestly only as good as the amount of metal that they're cooling. So if you can have 3 fans on a really terrible thin heatsink, and yeah, it's driving a lot of air over that surface area, but there's not a lot of surface area to begin with. So remember, the amount of surface area is also important. So the size of the cooler can also be important. That's why you can see certain 3-fan card designs. I'm thinking in particular of the Asus TUF 5700 XT graphics card was terrible for cooling. That was a 3-fan card, and it didn't do as well as some of the 2-fan 5700 XT cards, like the Pulse, for instance, the Sapphire Pulse and the Sapphire. Anyway, it's the Sapphire cards. So there's a lot of things that go into it. It's not just the number of fans, but it's also the overall metal surface area that's cooling. The bigger the heatsink, the more those fans are going to be able to be used. Kimoy Milo asked, DisplayPort or HDMI? I think I've answered this in the past, but I also feel like I can't probably say this enough. So DisplayPort. And this is a very generic answer. You may have a reason to use HDMI, especially if you have one of the new HDMI 2.1 monitors. That might be a reason for you to use HDMI 2.1. But for most users, the reason I say DisplayPort is that FreeSync, the FreeSync is much more common than G-Sync on monitors. And yet, NVIDIA GPUs that use G-Sync are much more common. But NVIDIA GPUs will use FreeSync on the monitor as long as you're using the DisplayPort cable. So whenever I give just generic advice like this, DisplayPort versus HDMI, unless you're dealing with HDMI 2.1, especially if you have an NVIDIA graphics card and a monitor with FreeSync, I would use the DisplayPort cable every single time. Jim asks, when am I going to start selling a range of PC Builder cat theme merchandise? Jim, you probably remember this because you've been a subscriber for a long time, but we actually did a whole line of merch. I'm a PC Builder, so there's some screws rattling around in there. And you can still get these. We've actually taken it down. I think people want something cool, not necessarily cute. We're gonna keep the cute designs when we do some cool ones and when we relaunch it. So you'll still be able to get stuff like that. But we will redo the merch. We did it much earlier on in the life of the channel. I don't think we had enough subscribers at the time, but we're closing in on 100,000 now. So that's definitely something in our future. Azedius asks, with the power consumption of future GPU architectures such as RDNA 3 and Lovelace, how do you think we're going to deal with the heat and the temperatures? Will a water block for GPUs be necessary? Yeah, everybody seems to want to just dump tons and tons of power into your PC. Now, I don't really like this trend, but I understand it because gamers have in the past not been sensitive to power usage. We're sensitive to performance. If you can give us 3 more FPS for 10,000 more watts, it seems like most gamers we'll take that. You know, obviously, I think we're seeing some of the edge cases with that, for instance, with a 12900K, where people are starting to back off and say, wow, I don't know if I want to have to buy a 360 millimeter all-in-one liquid cooler in order to cool this thing and then still be worried about the temps on it. So I think there is a limit there, and we're starting to tease out where that is. But I would just say that there's always going to be lower power versions. They tend to push the highest end stuff, so the 6900 XT or the RTX 3090 on graphics cards, right? They tend to push the highest stuff way too far. And remember, it's not a linear, well, if I give it, 10% more wattage, I'm going to get 10% more performance out of it. Typically, it's linear scaling up to a point, and then you hit a massive amount of diminishing returns, where maybe every 100 extra watts you get, or I should say maybe every extra 10% of power you get, you only get 3% more performance. And then for the next 100 watts, maybe you only get 1% performance, or so on and so forth. You get the idea. Basically, you hit what's called the law of diminishing returns, and then you hit the theoretical maximum, whether that it ends up being cooling ability through the cooling solution. Do I think that water blocks are going to become more common? On the highest end parts, absolutely. I think that is the way we're going. People should get comfortable with all-in-one liquid cooling again if you want to be always at the very bleeding edge of the technology, including CPUs and GPUs, because I think we are coming to a point where the power usage alone is going to necessitate that for the absolute high end, but for everybody else, you'll be okay. Delios asks, what are my ambitions for the future? They recently found the channel. Keep up the good work, Mr. Jason. Well, thank you very much for that. I appreciate it. Right now, we're super focused on hitting 100,000 subscribers. It is coming. We're hoping to do it by the end of this year or early in January. And we are, if you haven't noticed, we're moving to produce more content. So right now we're trying to get out at least every 2 weeks, we're trying to get out an additional video. My goal with the channel is just to make it the best PC building channel, especially accessible for folks who are new and returning builders. And I also want folks who are kind of in the mix and in the community to feel like they're always learning something as well. I always want a couple of nuggets of advanced stuff for the more advanced users as well. So that's my goal for the channel. Thus far, knock on wood, we've been doing really well with it. Thank you so much for joining us on this month's Q&A. If you got value of the video, remember to give it a big like. He really appreciates that. And of course, subscribe and click the bell icon. That way you get notified when we go live with new content. With that, we will catch you on the next one.